So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about some general patterns of infectious disease. I'll talk about two ideas. Periods of disease are how symptoms change over the duration of an infection. These periods relate the infection, or the growth of the pathogens in the body, to the disease effects. I'll also talk about stages of pathogenesis. These explain how a pathogen creates an infection in a person and then is transmitted to a new host. I'll also talk throughout about the idea that disease is a relationship between a host and a pathogen. Hosts have ways to resist parasites. They have physical defenses and immune systems. Also, whether someone gets sick or not can depend on underlying health conditions. Pathogens have ways to evade and overcome host defenses. These we call virulence factors. The severity of a disease can depend on the biology of that specific pathogen. So, periods of disease are the changes in the disease over a course of time. Here we'll talk about general patterns of disease. Specific diseases proceed in different ways. Symptoms are caused by both pathogen factors and the host response to the pathogen, but the effects of both are related to the number of pathogens in the body. The first period is the incubation period. This is when the pathogen enters the host and begins to reproduce, but there are not enough pathogens to cause disease symptoms. Symptoms begin during the prodromal period. The pathogen continues to multiply, and the immune system reaction causes many of these initial symptoms. The period of illness is when the pathogen reaches its peak and the symptoms are the most severe. If the immune system mounts a successful defense against the pathogens begin to decline and the symptoms begin to resolve during the period of decline. Then, during the period of convalescence, symptoms resolve completely. During this time, the immune system continues to clear reproducing pathogens from the body. It should be noted that some diseases can cause lasting damage, and this is not completely recovered from. This graph shows the relationship between the number of pathogen particles in red and the severity of symptoms in blue for a general period of disease. You can see from this graph that during the incubation period, there are pathogens present in the infected person, while the symptoms have not yet increased from zero. During the prodromal period, those symptoms increase along with the number of pathogens until the peak of the period of illness. The symptoms and pathogens decline during the period of decline, and the symptoms resolve during the period of convalescence, while it takes a bit longer for the pathogen particles to be removed from the body. Note on this graph that during the increase in the number of the pathogens in the body, symptoms lag slightly behind the pathogen particles. This is because those symptoms are caused by both the pathogens themselves and the body's response to those pathogens. Also, during the period of decline, the symptoms precede slightly the decline in the number of pathogens. Also, during both the incubation period and the period of convalescence, there are no symptoms, yet there are still pathogen particles present in the person. Different diseases proceed in different ways, and this is particularly true of acute versus chronic diseases. As you'll recall, acute diseases are diseases that occur over a short period of time. Symptoms are sometimes intense, but the immune system eventually clears the pathogen. Influenza is an example of a disease that usually occurs in acute periods. A chronic disease is a disease that occurs over a long time span. The pathogen reproduces typically at a low level, but tissue damage can accumulate, for example, in hepatitis C. A latent infection is when a pathogen goes dormant for a long period of time with no replication. This happens in tuberculosis, caused by the bacteria Mycobacterium tuberculosis, going dormant, ceasing to reproduce within lung alveoli tissue. Chagas disease is an example of a disease that has both acute and chronic periods. Chagas is caused by an eukaryotic microbe, Trypanosoma cruzi, and is spread by the insect known as the kissing bug. This pathogen causes an acute illness that usually has an onset 1 to 2 weeks after the infection of the eukaryote. The acute phase is extremely intense, characterized by swelling and intense fever. However, those symptoms resolve typically after 8 to 10 weeks. In some patients, the immune system fails to entirely clear the pathogen, leading to a low-level chronic infection. While the symptoms of the chronic disease are not as acutely intense, those chronic infections can continue to damage the body. Chronic Chagas disease leads to heart failure. The stages of pathogenesis explain what the pathogen is doing during an infection, how a pathogen enters and creates an infection in a person, and then is transmitted to a new host. The stages are exposure, adhesion, invasion, infection, and finally transmission. Pathogens produce virulence factors, including toxins that aid in these steps. In order to survive and proliferate, pathogens have to evade the host immune system. Exposure is the first stage in pathogenesis. This is how the microorganism enters a host. Most pathogens have a preferred portal of entry. Those portals of entry include mucous membranes, which are present in the respiratory tract, the gastrointestinal tract, and the genitourinary tract. Pathogens also enter through the parenteral route. This is when pathogen is deposited directly into tissue through a break in one of the barriers, through a cut, a bite, or with a needle prick. The placenta typically provides a barrier for many diseases. The placenta is the barrier between the growing fetus and the mother. But some diseases, that we call torch diseases, can cross the placenta and require extreme precaution during pregnancy. TORCH is an acronym for toxoplasmosis, other, which is a group of diseases that include syphilis, chickenpox, hepatitis B, HIV, fifth disease, rubella, cytomegalovirus, and herpes caused by herpes simplex virus, HSV1 and 2. During pregnancy, obstetricians need to be careful for these diseases. Pregnant mothers are often advised to get boosters of many vaccines and avoid exposure to some of these particular pathogens. For example, toxoplasmosis is spread by the feces of common house cats. And pregnant women are generally advised to avoid doing tests such as changing the litter box. This graph shows the portals of entry on a person. Note that most of these portals are holes in the body, where sensitive tissue on the inside of us is exposed to the outside environment. Some of these portals include the eye, the conjunctiva, where mucous membranes for tear ducts are present, the nose, the mouth, the genitals, and breaks in the skin. The skin is typically a good barrier for most pathogens. Pathogens need to come in contact with susceptible tissue in order to begin an infection. Once inside a person, the next stages of pathogenesis are adhesion and invasion. During adhesion, pathogens attach to a host by use of adhesins. These are proteins and other molecules on the outside of pathogens, both cells and virions, that those pathogens use to bind to host cells. We talked about some of these adhesins when we discussed viruses. Bacteria also use adhesins. Biofilms help some bacteria during adhesion, and bacteria also produce other proteins that help them attach to the host. During an invasion, the pathogen penetrates initial tissue and spreads deeper into the body. Helicobacter pylori, which is a bacteria that causes stomach ulcers, infects the stomach by producing an enzyme called urease that breaks down the gastric mucin gel lining the epithelial tissue of the stomach. The next stage of pathogenesis is infection. Infection is a successful replication of the pathogen in the host. A local infection is when the infection is confined to a small area of the body near the portal of entry. A focal infection is when an infection spreads to a secondary site. This includes infections such as bacteremia, which is the presence of bacteria in the blood, and septicemia is when bacterial infection begins in the blood. Bacterial infection in the blood can cause a condition known as septic shock. A systematic infection is when an infection moves throughout many systems of the body. This can create many complications during a disease. During transmission, the pathogen exits the host and begins the stages of pathogenesis in another. Portals of exit include the respiratory tract, the genitourinary tract, and the gastrointestinal tract, as well as skin and blood. Many pathogens exit the host via the same portal that they entered. This figure shows some of those portals of exit. Note that many of these portals excrete fluids from the body. Different pathogens adapt to dissolve themselves in those fluids and come into contact with new hosts. Pathogens often stimulate bodily functions that promote their exit. For example, influenza stimulates coughing and sneezing. Salmonella bacteria stimulate diarrhea and vomiting. Influenza enters a new host through the mouth, and salmonella is typically spread through GI transmission. During what period of a disease are pathogens transmitted? Generally, pathogens are more likely to spread when there's a higher concentration of the pathogen in the body. The period of illness is usually the time when a disease is spread, but this depends on the specific pathogen. Pathogens are present during the incubation period and the period of convalescence, so a disease can be transmitted throughout the entire time course. During the period of incubation and the period of convalescence, a person might not know they are transmitting, but can make another person sick. Virulence factors are proteins and other genes that bacteria and viruses use to promote the stages of pathogenesis. Adhesion factors are factors that are produced in order to aid the adhesion step. These include biofilms and virus spike proteins such as hemagglutinin. Exoenzymes and toxins are enzymes and other chemicals excreted by pathogens to break down host tissue, often to promote invasion. These include urease, which we discussed for Helicobacter pylori, and hemolysins. There are also virulence factors that allow bacteria and other pathogens to survive in the host and evade the immune system. A primary pathogen is a pathogen that causes disease regardless of the microbiota or the immune status of a person. Primary pathogens typically have many virulence factors in order to reproduce inside of a defended host. Opportunistic pathogens, though, cause disease in opportunistic conditions, when a compromised immune system is present from AIDS or chemotherapy, when there is damage to protective barriers, when there's change in the normal microbiota. Underlying health conditions can be risk factors for both primary and opportunistic pathogens. Conditions that allow opportunistic infection can increase the likelihood of primary pathogen infection.